Okay, well, welcome. I think we lost a couple of people in the transfer, but they can listen or show up later.
You handled that like a pro, Lynn.
Well, like an amateur,
You did.
but a perfectly
I
okay
would
amateur.
I would have been on the floor crying.
Uh,
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, well, Sebastian's here, I think. I see your name, Sebastian, but I don't, there you are.
Yes.
Okay, well, my sincere apologies. It was very so nice of you to take your time anyway to do this. And now I've wasted half an hour of your life, but let's get started. So what I'm hoping we can do today is take a look at how awakening, transcendence, and all of the experiences that go with it can be somehow translated into a film, and how we can take people who are in this fairly exalted state of consciousness and portray them in an effective way. So Sebastian here is the producer, the director, and the writer of this film. And I'm told he even considered doing the acting, but got a little overwhelmed with the other three jobs. He's a Renaissance man in every sense of the world. He's had a global upbringing. He's an intellectual, he's a businessman, he's an artist, he's an athlete, a major athlete. And he has multiple credits to his name in the acting and producing of movies. Plus, he's had a long connection with many varied aspects of the evolution of consciousness. So his resume is way too long to enumerate, but I hope you go to the forum link, which if you go into the notice of this talk, there'll be a link to the forum, and it has links to his site and some of his work in all of these different domains. And if you haven't seen the movie Grace and Grit yet, you'll find a way to do that there. So I'd like to start, Sebastian, if I could, with your background in all things spiritual, and then lead into the specific expression of that in Grace and Grit. So it seems like you started really young. You talked about Zen talks from your father and comic books from India. I assume you lived in India when you were a child. So how did you develop an interest in spirituality, and then maybe how did it mature for you?
I think my father was a professor of comparative religions with a specialty in India. And my stepfather was, so I went to Catholic school and church, and then my father was Jewish. And sitting in on my father's classes in Hawaii, where we moved from England with his specialty in India, I just think that initially that iconography from Hindu and then Buddhist traditions spoke to me probably on some intuitive level. I think as something captures us all when we're kids, we see a movie or songs or imagery that touches us in some way. And I think the power, particularly in this context of media, that we see a movie, whether it's mythic like Superman, or a story from the Bible, or, any number of different religions, that they speak to us in a way that intuitively, I think even at that juncture when we're pre-conceptual, that it awakens something in us, that we have a loose sense of what are we really doing here? What's really going on? Life is so ridiculous. And I think that time before we're 9 or 10, before the concrete operational mind develops, before we can apprehend and articulate concepts and hold them and work with them, there's a fluidity, I think, that affects us all, whether we're aware of it or not, at a very early age in terms of what we're ultimately going to be interested in and what questions we continue to explore. And I think that for everyone on this call or participating in this type of conversation in the worlds of psychology and philosophy and spirituality and meditation and consciousness, we all have some sort of sense of that interest from early on, somewhere inside, whether it's a dream that we had as a kid or, in order to dedicate so many hours later in our lives with this interest about what goes on beyond us. I think it's sparked there. So for me, I think that particular spark came from the juxtaposition of these two very diverse and differing worlds, being England and Hawaii, Texas, with different rules, and trying to reconcile all of these differences into one sort of cohesive identity or personality. And I think probably that resulted in an interest in theater and poetry and reading, an interest, in other words, in joy and in tears, an interest in a genuine interest in human connection, not just from a moral perspective, but just from a comfort perspective, that it really feels great to connect with humans, that this is a wonderful, wonderful thing. And this is really all that matters.
Oh, that's beautifully said. You know, I think if I could do something, it would be to create ways to transmit, you know, beauty and joy and transcendence to people. So I envy your skill in that area. So you got drawn to film. You said you called your interest in the theater a first form of meditative practice and the experience of a safe and near limitless space for dynamic personal exploration and expression. I wonder if you could sort of unpack that thought for us, if you remember it.
Sure. First, on the coattails of what you were saying, I mean, thank you for bringing us all here today. Yeah, I mean, these discussions don't happen unless someone puts them on the calendar and invites everyone. So thank you so much for that, Lynn, and your integrity and discipline and follow through for making these things a priority. I think that theater, I think in the reconciling of understanding what was going on in the world with sort of extreme circumstances, I think theater did offer a safe space for me. In other words, that from people outside of psychology or philosophy, the posture by which we enter a discussion is everything. It's the container for it, right? And that's such a big deal. And for people outside of that, people don't think about that. But for anyone who's reads and is interested in psychology, philosophy, and spirituality, we know that that's so much of it. So in other words, I think theater offered a paradigm that says, I'm going to discover things in myself through you. And in doing that, I might become uncomfortable. And thank you in advance for allowing me to be uncomfortable, for me to be able to find a space that's acceptable where I'm not being judged, where I can really touch these different facets of myself. And in conjunction with that, I'm going to offer that same space for you, that you can feel totally comfortable in feeling all the things that you need to feel and express, and you can get to know those things through me. Anger, disappointment, embarrassment, elation, joy, any of those things. And so I think that theater was an interesting and safe space to develop and locate those different aspects of my own personality. And I think that's ultimately on a base level why we as children always play, right? That we're playing in order to be aggressive, to be passive, to be tender, to be sad, to be elated. And that's the value of play. And that's why we seek to find that play again as adults between one another.
Fantastic. You know, I think that's true. I had never thought about movies that way, but it allows me to enter into and play without having to be myself. There's the self-consciousness is completely gone by entering into the movie and entering into the character's life, identifying with the characters.
I was also thinking of, and I've had this discussion with a group of theater actors and interested also with histories in psychology in Russia about the role of acting as a sort of, and I mean this in context of looking at the Hindu traditions and how all the gods are avatars of one another, right? And in thinking about the role of the actor, that God is ultimately in some way an actor through all of us. In other words, God is getting to know one another through each other, yeah? And I think that's a sort of beautiful analogy for what's really going on, right? That when we start to develop deep levels of compassion and tenderness, we can look at someone else at some point early on, hopefully, and see someone else crying, and it brings us to tears, or see someone else is challenging, and we feel that pain. That there's something in this sort of Martin Buber-esque I-thou relationship that's being born within us, that's innate, that doesn't require intellectual learning, that just we feel it by transmission. And I think in that way, theater and being at a play or reading a book, or listening to music, or then in this case immersively being in a movie, that we get to take on the hopes and aspirations, the disappointments and the joys of the characters that we see on screen, if we can feel our way into their worlds. And I think that's a powerful mechanism for state, for exploring different states of fear, of joy, of elation, of all these things. And then that can be a driver for our own development. Hopefully.
Yeah, I think so. And I was thinking a lot of people on this have probably gone to Sanjay's classes where we practice recognizing the character who is showing up within us. And the film is a perfect analogy for that, to step into the character there, but we also step into all these different characters that we exhibit here. So yeah, I like that. So I want, Grapes and Grit is a story that involves Ken Wilber, an eminent philosopher who several of us here, I think, have some connection to, some of us may not. And I just wonder if you could tell us how you got involved with Integral, how you came to know Ken, how you got interested in this book.
I was reading so many different philosophers and psychologists for so long, and just so many incredible minds. And then eventually, through anyone who's reading Ken Wilber, it's interesting because there's so many extraordinary writers that the power of their writing is that they have an accessible voice. Whether it's something pop or whether it's something scholarly, whether it's like James Hollis, who's the founder of, I think, the Jung Center in Houston, and a brilliant Jungian psychologist and one of my favorite authors. His books, What Matters Most, Finding Meaning in the Second Half of Life, just extraordinary, brilliant. And the power of that voice is that you can pick that up without having any requisite and just read it and really find again and again spectacular meaning and awakening lightning bolts. Same thing, even in a very broad level, like Don Miguel Ruiz with the Four Agreements. It's a very easy book to read. It's beautiful. It's powerful. Marianne Williamson, in terms of her work with A Course in Miracles and her articulation of the relationship between fear and love, and how the miracle exists between stepping from fear into love, into faith, in other words. And so these are all amazing, extraordinary authors. And then when somebody's reading probably enough books on consciousness, whether it's Jung or Freud or Schelling or Schopenhauer or any of these more contemporary, eventually it leads to Ken Wilber, I think. Because the scope and breadth of his work is so vast and deep that eventually it goes there. And the reason he's not a broad pop writer is because there's a requisite in reading his books that you can't just pick one up. You have to have read already a dozen or 100 other books. And so that happens to all of us who are on this path of interest in consciousness, that eventually we come across Ken Wilber, and it just happens at the right moment. And so for me, I'm one of many of people around the world that it just happened to me at the right moment. I was at that time really in love with Alan Watts. I was having this mad love affair with Alan Watts, and I thought, there were so many authors that I read. There was Schopenhauer that I adored, or Joseph Campbell, who was extraordinary, who I met also as a kid when I was in Hawaii. And then I read Ken Wilber's work, and it just blew me away on another level. That, like Alan Watts, he had a really profound, radical, sharp, exquisite mind that encompassed so much, and yet an intense sense of humor that was woven into that I think in scholarly reading is a treat, that we don't get to read minds that are so extraordinary that also have this radical sense of sort of joy and sort of Zen type style humor that Alan Watts certainly has. So I fell in love with Ken's work. I was reading a lot of his books, and then read Grace and Grit later in those books. And when I read it, I put it down and I was crying and I was in awe. And yet somehow I was totally inspired. And then I looked at how other people felt around the world about the book in all these different languages, and other people seemed to feel the same way. They were devastated by the loss and the challenge, and yet they were also inspired. And I thought, wow, there's something really special in here woven into this story that is inspiring. And what is that? And I had no idea of it as a movie, or me participating in it as a movie at that juncture. And eventually Ken and I met, and we were simpatico. And then I felt called to tell that story. I thought that I was the one that needed to tell that story, that I could tell that story, not just a love story, not just a story about illness, not just a story about courage, but a story about transcendent love. And so then subsequently we discussed it, and then it went from there.
Yeah, I had that feeling when I knew the book was, I knew you were doing the movie and I knew that it was coming up and I hadn't met you and I thought, oh my God, this could be terrible. I love the book so much and somebody could just destroy it. And so when we got a chance to talk, I was so relieved. I thought, oh my God, thank heavens it's Sebastian and not somebody else who's doing this book. So it's a very complicated book. For those who have read it, there are multiple themes interweaving through this book. There's Treya's experience through her journals. There's Ken's experience as a caregiver and lover, husband. There are musings on various attitudes toward illness in the culture and that sort of thing. There's the integral philosophy. And then there's this transcendent love story. And I would think most writers and producers would be really daunted by the thought of trying to take this book and put it into a 2-hour film. I couldn't see how that could possibly be done either. So, just grasping the integral theory would stop most people from, I think, trying to do it. So how did you face this massively complex work? And then what did you do to try to isolate what was important?
I greatly appreciate you stating that, because I think that it is a complex story. And I think those are the things that excited me about it. And I think perhaps why that book sort of chose me to tell it as a film, that I felt because I had already read and was familiar with Ken's work on such a deep level for over a decade, that I would be able to articulate subtly, without being pedantic or without being heavy-handed, without being intellectual, to be able to infuse that story as a movie with his work, with integral, showing it rather than stating it. And I thought that was important in terms of making that into a movie, that it had to inflect Ken Wilber's signature, very much so. I think that's why it succeeded as a script, and I think that's why he was very comfortable, that he thought, I think, or intuited or sensed that I would be able to do that. And I appreciate you saying that for a number of reasons, Lynn, because audiences are really responding strongly, almost across the board, with really, really enthusiastically. And yet some of the critics have loved it, whether it's Forbes or Screen Rant, or it's gotten great coverage at CNN, et cetera. But then other critics have been very aggressive against it. And it's interesting, the aggressive response, because you think that if someone listens to, like, let's say a Marvin Gaye song, about love, how could someone be so against that, right? Unless they've either never loved someone or lost someone before, or they totally don't understand it. Yeah. And I think that dovetails back into what we're discussing a second ago about how do you come across Ken Wilber, that it's so complex and vast that there is a requisite. And perhaps to see this movie, there is a requisite that requires a certain amount of sentience within one's self, that most of the critics who are reviewing broad pop films are looking at superhero movies, and praising those, and this might not sit with them, and that's okay. That's certainly okay. So I think that I had the opportunity to make this film early on for a broader audience, meaning a broader budget with sort of big, movie stars, for like a $10 million budget that the company wanted to finance it for and fund it for as a vehicle for acclaim for their company. And I turned that down because I knew that this wasn't a broad pop film, that this is a film that is for a specific audience, that it might later reach a broad audience, but I needed to make a more humble film, or a more specific movie that really penetrated into what the key themes are in the story, which in this case, as you said, one of is transcendence. And I think that then in terms of the craftsmanship, just the basic cabinetry making, of the movie. How did I tackle that? That was the question. The book is 400 pages, so I broke it down into 4 100-page sections, and then I use a number of different highlighters of different colors. You know, what stays in, what gets left out, what stays in, but stays in just visually or metaphorically, what stays in but comes at a different place, like that. And then in the first draft of the script, it was maybe 165 pages or something like that. And then I took it down to 145, and then eventually we shot 117, I think, something like that.
That's fascinating. I've actually never heard anybody talk about actually going through the, but that's a really interesting idea for a lot of things, actually. Multiple highlighters, what's in, what's out. I like it.
Yeah, also I wanted to, on what you said about, the complexity of the themes in the book, my duty as a storyteller is to stay true to this story, is to stay true to the original work, whether I like it or not. If I take this on, my karmic obligation is to tell the true original story that chronicles this human being, Treya's journals, right? Above and beyond everything. And Ken's writing and their work and their love and that story. And it was interesting because I flew to Colorado before the movie came out to show it to Ken. And on the way, I was rereading Chögyam Trungpa's The Myth of Freedom. And I'm a big fan of his work, and I've read all of his books. And I was rereading it on the way, and I'm on the plane. And then, the thing is, basically, the book is about meditation and about how not to intellectualize spirituality, right? And it's essentially about a text on Hinayana Buddhism and Zen. And, Trungpa has a brilliant sense of humor also, but point being is that there was this like interesting non sequitur paragraph within the book that I was reading before I landed in Colorado, and it talked about movies just out of nowhere. And it said, and these are his words, he was saying something like, Chögyam Trungpa was saying, we had, and this is 1976, right? He says, we held a film conference or a film workshop in Colorado. And at the workshop, people asked me, is it important to give audiences what they want, or is it important to make a good movie, he was saying. And the answer is it's more important to make a good movie. That if we give audiences what they want, we're consistently and continually bending down and bending down and bending down until the whole thing becomes absurd. What is important is to deliver a movie that is good, that raises audiences up, that gives them something perhaps that they don't think they want to see, but that they need to see. Yeah, that we offer up something that sparks something, that awakens and touches something within, that may not be received well at the beginning, but then they may later, when the audience catches up, be very well received. And it meant a lot to me when I read that before landing in Colorado, because I thought, yeah, this movie is a glorious, uplifting, hopeful movie like the story is, but it's also devastating. It also hurts. It's also hard to this isn't something you get together with a group of friends and say, let's have a lot of popcorn and hang out on Friday and watch a really fun movie. This is not that movie. But it is experiential. In other words, that somebody has to be ready to sit through it and say, I want to feel the devastation. I want to feel the hope. I want to feel the love, like a meditation. And I wanted to make a movie that was experiential, that would take someone through romantic, passionate, courageous, selfless, and ultimately transcendent love, as the book took me through those things.
Yeah, I think the point about giving people what they need rather than what they want, we've seen mostly what they want, I think, out there, and we can see the consequences of that. And I know Ken Wilber said, Sebastian Siegel is an integral artist driving consciousness evolution. And that seems to me something that's really badly needed here. So capturing this transcendent quality, I noticed at the end of the movie, Ken says something about the transcendent, somehow our love lives on. And Treya says, I pay more attention to life. And I think of Ken's transcendence and immanence, that you're capturing both of those in this movie. And so how do you go about doing that? I mean, just to take these ideas and then portray them in these characters seems to me a really an artistic venture for sure.
The question is how to capture that transcendent
Yeah, the transcendence
result.
and the immanence both. Yes, and how to, because these are non-concrete, not even subtle things. And how do you bring those into this concrete environment that you're working with?
You know, I have to say that in a lot of ways, I can't take responsibility for that because it's in the book, it's written in her journals, it's written in their journey. So for me to put it on screen is just to take it from one medium to another. So if I can, and I set out with that duty in mind. In other words, if I can put on screen what's going on inside of his head and inside of her head, also reveal the plot of what's going on inside of their lives, and if I can portray and evoke and articulate the journey that they're both going through subtly and emotionally, then I'm doing the job of the book. Yeah, that I'm transcribing that from book to screen, and I just stay true to that. You know, I kept about. In other words, the answer is just in very simple terms, just to put what was on the page on the screen. In this case, as being comfortable and having a history of painting things on screen, I was using things metaphorically like his feeling trapped or unable to express with his lover the feeling of lack of oxygen and drowning. And so I shot many scenes with his character underwater, but also the water being the symbol of the self, and that oftentimes when we're dreaming and we're in the water, we're having an overwhelmment perhaps sometimes of self, that there's about to be a breakthrough perhaps in the sort of Freudian sense of dream interpretation. And then with her, this search going up a hill that in the book takes place actually in a cavern with stalagmites and stalagmites. And in this case, I chose it for cinematic qualities and purposes. She's going up a hill and she's searching. What's she searching for? We find out at the end, she's searching for this place beyond time, that field that Rumi talks about. In other words, and also ultimately her connection with him beyond life. And him underwater looking for the surface, ultimately he's searching for that same thing in the stars where life echoes on, and ultimately for her. And so while they're in this world finding each other and then they're ripped apart, in these two other worlds, him underwater going to the surface at the end and seeing the stars, and her on the hill going to the end, eventually reaching the top beyond this biblical tree, and being in the rain, that they see each other, they touch each other, and they find each other. Yeah, and I think that perhaps going into the film, someone might for the first time subtly feel that, but then in watching it again or another time, say, okay, this really makes sense. And I certainly think there are many movies that I've watched on a number of times through that meant one thing to me at one juncture and then meant something else to me at another juncture when I was perhaps ready to perceive those things. So, you know, to take 400 pages and put it into an hour and 48 minutes requires truncating a number of different things, you know. And so you see us all and other people reading a book, and then they see the movie and they'll say, oh, well, the book was so much better. You're right. All the people always say this, of course, because the book, we're automatically attaching avatars that we like, you know. The person walks into the room, X happens. We automatically have a vision of what the room looks like and what the person looks like. You know, whereas in a movie, we have to make a choice. And sometimes that choice leaves out things, yeah, includes other things, but leaves things out. So in this case, painting it on screen, what was so important, using the actors, the characters, the dialogue, but also the lighting, the way we use light as a character in this film, and the way we use sound and music specifically as a character in the movie. In other words, the plot is a story about a man and a woman, but the theme is really a story about the moon and the stars, or the sun and the stars, as being lived and spoken through these two people. And so that has to be spoken, you know, articulated through these visuals, through the dialogue, and through the light, and through the use of music and sound.
The actors, you had to transmit this. I assume, of course, they probably read the book several times and had a sense for them. Was there anything that you had to do to bring them into this world to help them understand it?
No, these two actors are just brilliant, and I think that that's a collaborative process. And it's a process of faith and of trust and of homework. And I think good casting in any movie is about casting actors who archetypally already have those things inside of them, and have something going on in their lives that allows them to pull those archetypes and put them on screen. So when I was thinking about casting Treya and Ken, I didn't think about the look of the character of the actors at all, not at all. It was only about who are these people internally, and I don't know who the actor is. But when I meet those actors, I will know, because I know these characters first. So Amina, I hadn't thought about, and we met and we were working together, and she just had this presence and emotional availability, and demonstrated a vulnerability in the work that she was doing when we met. And I thought, and then we started to talk, and I thought, as a person, she kind of emulated certain things that I thought were integral to who Treya's character was. And then, she read the script, and she just was like, I have to play this. I must play this. And I thought that was the most important thing, that I knew that this woman, and there were a lot of actresses that I was exploring and thinking about and adapting the script, the book to script, that helped me think about the mannerisms. But I knew when I met the actress that it would be something that she knew she had to do inside. And so then Mina and I met and discussed it, and she cried like 3 times at the meeting, our first meeting together, talking about the script and her relationship with love and her husband. And I just knew she was the one. I didn't make the choice. It was like, it was just made, and I felt it. Yeah. And so then same thing. Then after that, we were getting down to the wire. We had a go point, and I was being sent all these names of like a lot of different famous big actors and this and that. And I knew I didn't want a celebrity. In other words, a famous, like that kind of actor. I wanted a real brilliant actor to play this. That it's daunting to take on the role of Ken Wilber. How do you play someone, who's such a prolific person in a particular field, and also someone who's living today, that the actor really need to embody these things. And then so when Stuart and I connected, he has a certain masculinity that's juxtaposed with a tenderness and a compassion and an emotional availability that I think is innate in Ken's work and writing. And he's also got a great sense of humor. And that was really important, because there's so much nonverbal communication in his character throughout this movie, because Ken as a personality, if you look up Ken Wilber images online, you're not going to see but 20 images of somebody like this. There aren't many, especially from that time, because he's such a reclusive guy. So he, in other words, as a character, in terms of showing this as a movie, he plays his cards close to home. And in the movie, for those of you who've seen it, and if you haven't, please watch it tonight. The first moment we see him show any emotion, he shows the audience and no one else, right? For his wife, he has to stay strong. And he's like, hey, babe, I'll be right back. And they're about to go through this procedure. And he's like, he walks down the hall, and then it gets darker and darker and darker. And he goes through this path until he finds a room alone. And he just leans down and he cries. That only the audience knows that, no one else. That was what was occurring in his life, that he had to go into this dark space in order to locate something within that he couldn't find when he was around anyone else, because he had to carry the ship and the strength. And every man and every person knows that at some point we have to be strong for our lover, our friend, our family, our child, or whoever the thing is, and we can't show it to them. In other words, that we're blocked out of intimacy, out of regard for the relationship, out of duty. So I knew that the actor had to be able to carry that kind of thing. Stuart has 2 kids. He was going through a split, so he had an enormous emotional well to pull from, and it was the right moment at the right time. And he was the guy, and it is impossible for me to think of any other actor who could have played this. At the top end, I thought there were a few actors that could have done it. But after the fact, there's no way. He was meant to play this role. And then, synchronistically speaking, he had long hair, and he shaved his head literally an hour before the first shot. So we knew there was some similarities, yeah, and he and Mina looked good together. And but when he shaved his head and he came upstairs, we were literally, everybody was like, what is going on? He looks exactly like Ken. The ears and the nose and the eyebrows are strange. And for those of you who see the film, please stay through the end credits, because I have pictures of the actors next to each other, next to the real people, and it's extraordinary. It's uncanny, the remarkability of how remarkable it is, how much they emulated, looked like one another. So in terms of the casting and in terms of bringing those things out, Lynn, it starts there with the casting, and then also these actors are really prepared. They both, were reading the book again and again and again. Stewart was not familiar with Ken Wilber before that, but was familiar with Chung Yun Trumpa and was familiar with Alan Watts, and was a long-time meditator and sits in full lotus and has been, was really that guy in a lot of ways. And so he went on a 10-day crash course of Ken Wilber, and I was giving him videos and talks, and he was just ripping through books, and he literally locked himself away, I think, for like 10 days or something in his house and didn't do anything. He was just in a room doing nothing but, absorbing Ken Wilber. And then also, I think as an actor, at some point the actor has to depart from those people and who they are in the world, whether it's playing Alexander the Great or Abraham Lincoln or Ken Wilber. At some point the actor has to just give themselves to what's on the page. So both Stewart and Mina, at some point, they're saying, I have to be true to this material. And whoever this person is, ultimately, there's something going on here on the page that's emotional. And I need to show that, and I need to feel that. And if I feel it, it'll show. And these are actors, who are very seasoned and have the ability to play that instrument in a way that gets audiences to respond. And they did so beautifully in this movie.
Yeah, I think watching it, I think it does a wonderful thing in that it brings out Ken's humanity. So many people say he's Eddie, but he's just not. I mean, a very, very deep heart-centered character. I don't want to take all the time with my questions. I want to give other people time to ask questions too, but I just wanted to sort of finish up with this. This is really a story in part about Treya's awakening. I mean, she goes from, well, she was never an ordinary person, but she goes from certainly more conventional person to a person who can talk and live through this incredible event with the kind of what she calls passionate equanimity. And she says that in this final talk that she gives, that she is making friends with myself as I am and making friends with life as it is, which to me in a way is the definition of someone who is fully awake at this point. And so following that trajectory of her, that profundity, the way that she grows over those 5 years, I thought was so beautifully done. And I also, right at the beginning, I was noticing in the wedding ceremony, they talk about bringing out the courageous and the beautiful in each other. And somehow it's as if they had to raise the ugly and the scared in their lives in order to bring them to that place. So just this, and then finally this idea of the promise at the end, this agreement that he would find her. I don't know if you could just sum up a little bit about all of that, how you managed to take us on this journey that she lived and that he lived.
Yeah, thanks for bringing up that scene. In other words, the journey in this life and then the journey in the other world, the journey beyond life, and how do we marry those two things in this story. That wedding scene, and particularly that dialogue, that line of the man who marries them. First of all these characters are based on real people. A lot of it is actual, directly from her journals. Those particular lines, the wedding vows that I wrote that's not from the book, from the journals, but it happened in that way. And I've, interviewed and had dinner with people who were there at the wedding, etc. And I've done a lot of for many, many years around this, yeah, to stay true to it. But in that line particularly, it's an interesting line, and it's an interesting moment in the movie, because the first 20 minutes, 18 minutes of the movie, they're falling madly in love. And when we get to that scene, that's the first time that I take the audience into, or the second time maybe that I take the audience into a space that's sort of beyond life, that's sort of a little bit of a dream world. In other words, when I make a movie, I want the characters to feel real. I want the people to feel real, the tears to feel real, the pain to feel real, the joy to feel real. And then once the audience feels that way, then we can, as audience, we can venture off a little bit. We can float off into the other world, into this sort of world beyond, and then come back. Because that's how we experience life. That's how we remember things. We remember things as magical and mystical. We experience things as magical and mystical, as mundane and sacred simultaneously. One day it's just a gardenia. The next day it's the whole cosmos right there in your hand, right? And that's how life is, yeah? One day it's just a breath, and the other day it's like, oh my God, it's full. It's so full, it's so big, it's so great. So in the wedding scene, I wanted to take that opportunity to take a bit of a leap, to push into this world, and that's the first time we see her inside of her head. And so I think for the integral audience, going gross, subtle, causal, this world and the other world, and I'm using it musically too, with binaural sound waves in the film, to try to coax the brain from beta, alpha, theta, delta, and back up and back down a little bit. And that's the first time I use binaurals in the movie also. But the point being that there is a bridge between this life and the next. Like birth is a bridge, between what exists prior to now. Just as prior to birth, there is the passage of the birth canal. Just as prior to that, there's this gestation period in the womb. Just as prior to that, there's consummation. Just as prior to that, there's the electrical current of two people meeting. Just as prior to that, this pattern goes back millions and millions and billions of years. And so that's what really interests me, right? That life does go on, whether we like it or not. This is not a spiritual or religious belief. This is a fact. This is actuality. That in 20, 50, 100 years from now, we'll say, how were we having such ridiculous conversations about life? Of course it goes on. Of course it's redundant, right? So to speak to that through these two individuals' journey in this life, I thought was the most integral and important thing to tell in the movie. And so I tell it in dreams, and then I tell it also, it starts to show up in the dialogue subtly in that wedding scene. And then, in the end, obviously, that's taken pretty much directly from her journals. I'll find you, you promise you'll find me, I'll be there. Her journey up the side of the hill ends up in the rain, and she's seeing and feeling him in the world beyond. His is in the water, and he ends up above the water looking at the stars. That at that moment he's devastated that he's going to lose her, and he knows it. But at the same time, he's elated because he knows he's ultimately already with her, and he's always been with her, and he's always going to be with her forever. Yeah. And then in the end of the movie, the last scene I have is these two drops of water falling into this, and that's sort of metaphorically speaking to their connection to this greater pool that we are all in, of love, of life beyond, of love beyond. And so I think that in terms of a movie, like a poem or like a song, we can't put it in intellectually. We have to represent it in ways that is absorbable for anybody. Yeah. As a reading, Khalil Gibran, or listening to great, music, like this song by U2, the song One. I know every time I hear that song, I get a tear in my eye. The song's so powerful. And because it says so much, and I hear different things in it depending on how I show up to it. So, ultimately, I think that this movie, like any other film that really is carrying something deep down inside that is worth paying attention to in ourselves and in life, is really about how do we carry on, how do we go beyond. And I've been rocked and awakened by so many movies like that, whether it was, The Fountain or Titanic or Apocalypse Now or Braveheart. That these movies have spoken to me and so many audiences in a way to say, hey, there's something that's deep down inside me that's indelible, that's impenetrable, right? And I only know that by experiencing it, by touching it again. How do I touch it again, that space inside of me? By prayer, by meditation, by discussion like this, and by choosing the words and the books and the songs and the movies that I'm going to allow into my mind, that I'm going to invite in. So I think that it's on the screen because it's in the book. And I think that I was drawn to tell this story because I was up for the challenge of being able to put those things on screen. And I hope that when you see it, that you'll feel that. And if you do, let me know. And if you don't, let me know. That's fine too.
Thank you. Well, I've seen it twice now, and you're right. The second time I see so much more in it, and just a beautiful, beautiful film. You almost have me in tears here again talking about it today. So I could say a lot more, but I'd like to give everybody else here a chance to ask some questions of your own or contribute anything that you'd like to do. So.
I will say, I would just like to quickly note that, big studios, used to spend millions and hundreds of millions of dollars on billboards and things like this, and they don't anymore. They spend it all online, so they really own a lot of the critics, and they own a lot of these websites, and they are drivers of what gets seen. And a movie like this does not get seen without support from people. So if you think that, even whether you like the movie or not, if you think it's important and it needs to be seen, that it can open up sentience and compassion between human beings, as the book did to me and to so many people around the world, please write a review about it online. The 3 most important sites to write those things on would be Rotten Tomatoes, Amazon, and then IMDb, Fandango, Apple. But Rotten Tomatoes particularly, and Amazon, 38% of viewers will read audience reviews before they make a choice. If you make the time to do that, it would be hugely appreciated, not just by me, but everyone involved. And I think it's a good product, for the world to allow in. Yeah.
Yeah. So Joan, did you?
Yeah, well, I just wanted to say that I loved it. And I went in there wondering how this was going to turn out because of who Ken Wilber is and what he does and what he represents. And many movies that I have seen were not able to carry out what they wanted to. And you really hit it on the nail on the head. And I like the fact that it was so believable because the love that they felt for each other, you were just right in there. You were so happy the way that they expressed it and how they grew together because of that love. And then the disappointment and the fear and how that affected them. And you left that in there, which I thought was good. You didn't want to see Ken getting, and you didn't want to see her getting so frustrated and stuff, but it's a part of life. And I don't know how anybody could go through that, 2 people, and not feel that threatened and angry. It's like the process of grief. There's many stages of it. I thought it was wonderful. And I can't wait to see it again.
Thank you very much, Joan. There's so many incredible rom-coms and movies out there, love stories that follow a conventional trajectory, and they just get facsimiled, right, again and again and again. And I think one of the things that spoke to me about this book and about this story was that it shows really the way we love. Yeah, that love is so spectacular that it melts us, but it also crucifies us. But in that crucifixion, it makes room for resurrection, that we become more through loving. And it's only in that salt that it makes the cake sweeter. Yeah, in other words, it's only in our continual deepening discourse between between beings, whether it's lovers or friends or whatever the thing is, that the similarities allow us to have a conversation or start a conversation. But the differences is the magic. That's where the opportunity is for growth. Yeah, and I thought that was well expressed in this book, and I thought it was so important to show those things on screen. And when I was in the screenplay and I was, evaluating and getting notes from different peers, they were saying, "Wow, this is really intense. You have this hardcore fight, and you have all this. Like, do we really want to show that?" And I said, "We must. this is the way we love. This is the way we all love. We've all done things that we thought, God, I shouldn't have done that, you know, and yet it made us more. You know, we've all done things and experienced things that where we are at our worst. And it's through that then we allow ourselves and can become through one another, through the patience and forgiveness and acceptance of one another, our best. Yeah, so I thought that was, thank you for that, John.
Yes, great.
Can I ask a question about the Mariel Hemingway character?
Yeah.
Such a frustration that she seems so enamored with Ken, and barely a passing thought to the situation that Treya was in. Obviously, she was the one who recognized that the cancer was not gone, but had very little empathy or effort to even address that.
Thanks for that. So as it's written, yeah, in the book, yeah, it's taken almost directly from their journals. And I wanted to put that on screen exactly as it was shown, exactly as it was written. And the dialogue in that scene is almost verbatim from that, yeah. And so it's an important scene because it's based on a real person and it's obviously a real circumstance. And the tension and the humor that arises from that scene is because of the friction between these three characters. So in other words, Treya takes this really seriously, and this is something really important for her. There was a scene that happened before that I ended up cutting out of the movie that will be in the director's cut. By the way, there will be a longer version of this movie in maybe 24 months or 30 months when the timing is right. And that version of the movie will be like 2 hours and 2.5 hours. This movie is 1 hour, 48 minutes. So it'll be almost an hour longer with a lot of material that will support a lot of the things exactly that you're speaking to, Debbie. Things that I think are important in the book, but that for the purposes of a film have to get left out. But in terms of this scene, you know, Treya really wants to do this. And Ken says, look, I'm not buying this, but it's your decision, my love. And if you believe in this and you want to do this, let's have a discussion about it. Let's bounce it back and forth. I'm going to tell you what I really think. But ultimately, the decision's up to you. So they have that discussion. She says this is important to me. And so he says, okay, I don't buy it, but now that you've made the decision, I'm going to support you 100%. Let's go do this. So they travel up the coast, they go and see this woman, and they have this experience, and he's, you know, fully supportive of it. And the result, as he says in the book, in another scene that I cut that was actually after that scene, they're having a discussion in the car, that the net result ultimately of trying any therapy, whether it's with a conventional doctor or holistic or any kind of you know, therapy, the net result, if we believe into it, is some sort of joy and some sort of learning and some sort of opportunity always. And that's what they got out of this, that this was something that they were exploring in terms of the arcs of these characters, they were exploring every conventional doctor and every holistic modality. And they placed just as much value on both. Mm-hmm. In 400 pages and in 5 years, in an hour and 48 minutes, we're not able to see all those things. But we see a lot of them in this film, of which this is one. When it came time to cutting the film, it was important to make the first rendition of this movie under 2 hours. A lot of things got cut out. I was getting a lot of pressure to cut the scene out, but I felt it was really important to leave it in, so I kept it in. For a number of reasons. One, that it was so important to show this part of their exploration, which she then talks about in her speech that's in the credits, and it's in the movie also. But also it's a funny scene. That it's, in other words, they both have this sort of sense of humor, and that's really important to give audiences a little bit of breath. There are a lot of funny moments in this movie, and for audiences out there, when I watched it with Ken, he laughed out loud during a lot of the movie, where a lot of people won't be laughing probably. And in terms of, you know, Mariel as the actress, as the character, it's funny because I'm on my way to go see her right after I'm off here. I'm going to do her podcast, and we were on a show earlier this week. She's a brilliant actress, right? And she's been doing this, you know, she's Academy Award nominated actress, has been doing this her whole life. Archetypally, this character needs to be outrageous and eccentric and also brilliant. and that the audience has to not be sure which one this character is. Is this character brilliant? Or is this character nuts, right? And Mariel is this woman who is so wise and so grounded and yet outrageous and full of enthusiasm. I mean, this woman is like a burst of light, you know? I mean, she's got so much energy. It's like unbelievable. So when she leaned into that and went big with it, you know, it really brings that humor and that fun, and also that, you know, brings that into the character and the scene, but also what was written on the page and what was written directly in their journals. This, you know, this character is doing something. For those of you who haven't seen the film yet, you know, or who are going to watch it, or going to watch it for you know, another time. You know, this character is saying, "Hey, I'm feeling energy in you, and I want to shift that energy." Very real, right? This character is also saying, "No one has had the channels in their brain opened up as much as my channels." The character is saying, to 10 since the Buddha, and now me, and now you, Ken Wilber. Outrageous, okay? And there's a humor in that outrageousness. And the humor exists because it's both tender and real, and the care is there, but it's also outrageous, right? And that's when we're at a talk, or we're at a dinner, or we're with someone and we're like, and we can't hold back the laughter, because the pressure is to not laugh, but we have to let it out because it's so outrageous. And I think that's where we find the funny moments in life that are also tender. Yeah. And so, and I think it's on the screen. I think Ken certainly felt that it is. And so thank you for bringing that up and for voicing that.
And I got to ask one last thing, since I don't know about Ken Wilber's personal life. Did he ever remarry?
He did. He remarried. You know, it was a long period, you know, where he, after, you know, Treya passed, he wrote 3 books that have been hugely influential in the worlds of psychology and spirituality and philosophy. Grace and Grit, Sex Ecology, Spirituality, and A Brief History of Everything. And then started to write assertively after that. He did remarry for a brief period. They became very close friends, you know, an amazing woman. Essentially, she really wanted to have kids. I don't think he wanted to at that point. That his duty is, he's birthing already so much work as an author. This guy writes faster than I can read, right? You know, he's a book a year pretty much his whole life. And so then he has been, you know, loyal to that calling, yeah, that it just kind of rips through him. And I think ultimately when we have a calling like that at any point in our lives, we have to give ourselves fully to it. You know, I know that for me, I could relate to this in a way that you know, I've always wanted to have kids, but I've also felt that I don't want to be partial to being a father and partial to being a storyteller, that the time will happen when it's ready, when it's right. And right now, it's just not plausible for me, at least today, because my duties as a storyteller, I feel, are so important, are speaking through me, that I need to give my complete devotion to that. And I do. I'm relentlessly, you know, disciplined with that, as I think he has been and continues to be.
Well, I loved that scene because, if you know, my life has been dealing with illness for 35 years, and not my own, but as a caregiver, and just seeing all of the different things that get thrown on you, all the things you're willing to try, because of course you're desperate, so you go everywhere, and you run into characters like this, and I think it brings up the craziness of that search, you know, that the going anywhere, and the just all of the ways you can get hit back by these avenues that you go down and that are so strange. And I also thought it was really important in that I think I see illness as a spiritual path, and I see this movie as showing us that too. And there is so much out there in the world that tears people with illness down. And this movie brings out the heroism, the courage, and the growth that comes through the movie. So I think, you know, all of that, all of the pain that you show, all of the anger, it's so authentic. It's so real. People don't go through serious illness without major upheavals and major growth, particularly if they stay together through this. That's just an amazing thing. So I really thank you for doing that as well, bringing that in.
You know, Titanic is an amazing love story that also is, a huge, box office hit and a broad pop film. And I think one of the things about that film that's interesting is sure, it's the story of a sinking of a ship and these two people who fall in love, and everybody knows how it ends, and yet people want to see it because it's not really the story of a sinking of a ship. It's the sinking of the ship that creates the urgency for these two characters who might not have had the courage to love one another, who might not have defied all of the people and situations around them to love one another. It gives them the courage to say, we're confronting our mortality. We've only got 1 second left to live. Let's love each other. That's more important than anything. And I think that as humans, of course, we all know we're going to pass, but it's far enough off in the future, we think, that we don't have to pay attention to it. So we don't sign up for those things that are daunting. But if we knew that we were on a boat and it was sinking, we've only got a day left or a few days left, potentially we might say, oh my God, I got to do everything here and now. And I think that's what makes Titanic a great love story, is that these two people say, we're confronting our mortality. We've only got a second left. Let's step up and do what really matters. And so in the same way with Grace and Grit, illness is part of the plot, but it's not really the story. It's just the catalyst. It's the driver for these two humans to say, let's love each other and give everything we can. I mean, we're being ripped apart. If we're being ripped apart, let's find a way to let this thing echo on, to continue the dance and the song and the music, the moon and the stars through each other. Let's find that space beyond us and honor that space and celebrate that space as more real than this space, just as real as this space.
Beautiful, beautiful. Well, we've taken an hour of half of your time, 7 hours. So maybe this is a good note to close on. And to everybody who's watching this, please do go see this movie. You won't regret it.
Thank you all so much for having me here today. This is such a pleasure to be with you all and to participate and engage, with other humans who feel that certain stories are important. When I fell in love with psychology, and I think that word, psychology, the study of the soul, and what is it about poetry and music and paintings and movies that we love? And this book spoke to me in that way. And so it's such a real pleasure for me to participate with others who feel that same way, that we need to speak to the things that touch our souls. So I hope you see the movie. I hope you love it. If you do, please tell someone about it, and please write a review on one of those sites. That would be to introduce it to other people.
Thank you for bringing us here, Sebastian. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Wonderful.